She doesn't belong here." The words cut through the morning air like a blade, spoken just loud enough for Clara Reyes to hear. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to see the face behind the voice to know exactly what was happening. For the third time in 20 minutes, Clara felt the gentle but firm tap on her shoulder. The usher smiled apologetically, gesturing toward the back rows. "Ma'am, if you could just move to Section C, please. We need to make room for the VIP families." Clara stood without a word, clutching her worn leather purse. Her son Malik was somewhere backstage, preparing for the biggest moment of his 17 years. She had promised herself she would be there, in the front row, when he walked across that stage. But as she settled into her new seat, row 10, behind a pillar, 5 men in plain clothes appeared at the entrance of the auditorium. They didn't check in with anyone. They didn't show tickets. They just stood there, scanning the crowd with the kind of eyes that missed nothing. And when they found Clara, they didn't look away. Who were they? And why did it feel like they were waiting for something? Clara Reyes had learned to make herself small. At 42, she possessed the kind of quiet strength that came from years of fighting battles no one else could see. Her hands, permanently stained with motor oil despite endless scrubbing, told the story of a woman who fixed broken things for a living. Cars, engines, and somehow, against all odds, a future for her son. Dry Hollow, Nevada wasn't the kind of place where dreams came true. It was the kind of place where dreams went to die under the desert sun, buried beneath layers of dust and disappointment. But Clara had refused to let that happen to Malik. Her son was 17 now, a senior at Lakeshore Academy, the kind of private school that cost more per semester than Clara made in 6 months. He was everything she had never been allowed to be. Confident, articulate, destined for something greater than the small town that had tried to contain them both. Today, he would graduate as valedictorian, the first in their family to finish high school, let alone with honors. The road to this moment had been paved with sacrifice. When Hector died in that industrial accident 4 years ago, crushed by faulty equipment that the company later claimed was operator error, Clara had been left with nothing but debt and a 13-year-old boy who still waited by the window for his father to come home. The insurance company had fought them every step of the way. The lawyers had been expensive and ultimately useless. The community that had once embraced their mixed-race family suddenly found reasons to look the other way. But Clara had learned something in those dark months. Sometimes the system fails you so completely that you have to build your own. That's when she found Camp Doyle. It wasn't advertised in the local papers. You didn't stumble across it on the internet. Camp Doyle was the kind of place you heard about through whispered conversations in auto shops and late-night diners. A civilian training program run by former military personnel, designed for people who had been failed by every other system. Clara had driven out there on a Tuesday night in October, 3 months after Hector's funeral. She told Malik she was working late. She told herself she was just curious. But deep down, she knew she was looking for something she couldn't name, a way to become the kind of person who could protect what mattered most. The training had been brutal. Physical conditioning that left her muscles screaming, tactical exercises that pushed her mind beyond its limits, leadership scenarios that forced her to make decisions under pressure. But Clara had endured it all, driven by a single burning purpose: to become strong enough to ensure that no one would ever push her son to the margins again. She had earned her patch, a simple gray square with the word "guide" embroidered in black thread. It wasn't much to look at, but it represented something profound: the transformation of a grieving widow into a force of nature. Now, As she sat in the back of the auditorium, Clara's fingers found that patch sewn into the lining of her jacket. She had never told Malik about Camp Doyle. She had never told anyone. Some kinds of strength were meant to be invisible, working from the shadows to protect the light. But today felt different. Today, as she watched the other parents in their designer clothes and practiced smiles, Clara sensed that her years of quiet preparation were about to be tested. The men at the entrance hadn't moved, but their presence filled the space like a held breath. Malik deserved better than being pushed to the margins. He deserved to have his moment without apologies or explanations. And Clara Reyes, the woman who had learned to make herself small, was finally ready to take up the space she had always been denied. The ceremony was about to begin, and Clara had the strangest feeling that everything was about to change. Clara had arrived 30 minutes early, her name clearly printed on the reserved seating chart. Row 2, Seat 14. Right where a valedictorian's mother should be. She had checked it twice, smoothed her best blouse, and even allowed herself a moment of pride as she settled into the cushioned chair. That moment lasted exactly 7 minutes. "Excuse me, Mrs." The woman's voice dripped with the kind of politeness that barely concealed disdain. She was blonde, perfectly coiffed, wearing a blazer that probably cost more than Clara's monthly rent. "I'm Jennifer Morrison, head of the parent committee. I'm afraid there's been a small mix-up with the seating arrangements." Clara looked down at her printed ticket, then back at Jennifer. "I don't understand. This is where I was assigned." "Yes, well, we've had some last-minute VIP additions. Board members, major donors, you understand." Jennifer's smile never wavered, but her eyes were cold as winter steel. "We've found you a lovely spot in Section C. You'll still have a wonderful view." Section C was row 4. Clara moved without protest, telling herself it didn't matter. She could still see the stage clearly. She could still watch Malik receive his diploma. But 15 minutes later, another usher appeared. This time, it was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and an apologetic expression. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry, but we need to move you again. The photographer needs this row clear for the professional shots. Row 7, then row 10. Each move pushed Clara further from her son's moment, further from the recognition she had fought so hard to secure for him. With each relocation, she felt herself becoming smaller, more invisible, exactly the way she had learned to be for so many years. But something was different this time. As Clara settled into her latest seat, behind a pillar that blocked half the stage, she noticed the 5 men again. They hadn't moved from their position near the entrance, but their attention was laser-focused on her. Not on the stage, not on the other parents, but on her. The memories came flooding back without warning. Camp Doyle, the night exercises, the way Sergeant Martinez had looked at her during the final evaluation. "Reyes," he had said, his voice cutting through the darkness of the training ground. "You think leadership is about being seen?" Clara had been exhausted, covered in mud, her muscles screaming from hours of tactical drills. "No, sir." "Then why are you trying so hard to be invisible?" The question had haunted her for months. She had come to Camp Doyle to become stronger, but somewhere along the way, she had confused strength with silence, power with invisibility. She had learned to fight, to strategize, to lead, but she had never learned to take up space. Now, sitting in the back of her son's graduation ceremony, Clara understood what Sergeant Martinez had been trying to teach her. True leadership wasn't about commanding from the front. It was about knowing when to step forward and when to stand firm. It was about recognizing the moment when silence became complicity. She reached into her jacket and felt the patch again. Guide, not follower, not invisible. Guide. On stage, the principal was beginning his opening remarks. Clara could barely see him around the pillar, but she could hear every word. He spoke about excellence, about the bright futures awaiting these exceptional young people, about the proud families who had supported them. Proud families. Clara's jaw tightened. She was proud. She had worked 3 jobs to pay for Malik's tuition. She had spent countless nights helping him with homework, while her own eyes burned with exhaustion. She had sacrificed everything, her social life, her comfort, her own dreams, to ensure that her son would have opportunities she never had. But according to the people running this ceremony, she didn't belong in the front row. She wasn't the right kind of parent. She didn't fit the image they wanted to project. People will try to put you in a box, Hector had told her once, years ago, when they were young and still believed the world was fair. Don't let them. You're too big for their small thinking. Clara stood up, not to leave, not to find a better seat, but to claim her space. She walked to the aisle and stood there, her back straight, her chin lifted. If they wanted to move her, they would have to ask her to move. And this time, she would have an answer. The 5 men at the entrance shifted almost imperceptibly. One of them, a tall man with graying temples and eyes like steel, nodded slightly in her direction. It wasn't a greeting. It was recognition. Recognition of what? Clara didn't know, but she could feel something building in the auditorium. A tension that had nothing to do with graduation nerves and everything to do with the moment when invisible forces finally decide to reveal themselves. Malik's name was called. He stepped onto the stage, tall and confident, his cap slightly askew in the way that made him look younger than his 17 years. Clara's heart swelled with pride so fierce it nearly brought her to her knees. This was her son, her brilliant, beautiful, destined for greatness son, and she would be damned if she was going to watch his moment from the shadows. Malik stepped to the podium with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you've earned your place. His valedictorian speech began with a quote from Maya Angelou, his voice carrying across the auditorium with surprising strength for someone so young. "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found Clara. For a moment, his composure wavered, not from nervousness, but from something deeper. Love, gratitude, the weight of everything his mother had sacrificed. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. She stood in that aisle, claiming her space, refusing to be moved again. That's when it happened. The 5 men at the entrance began moving, not rushing, not drawing attention to themselves, but walking with the kind of purposeful stride that made everyone in their path instinctively step aside. They moved like water finding its level, like gravity pulling objects toward their natural place. The lead man, the one with steel-gray eyes, approached the ceremony coordinator, a nervous woman with a clipboard who had been orchestrating the seating arrangements all morning. He whispered something in her ear, then handed her a small object, a patch. Military issue, but not one Clara recognized. The coordinator's face went pale. She looked from the patch to the man, then to Clara, then back to the patch. Her hands were shaking as she took the microphone from the principal. "Ladies and gentlemen," her voice cracked slightly, We have a special presentation to make." The auditorium fell silent. Even Malik paused mid-sentence, his brow furrowed in confusion. The gray-eyed man stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had commanded respect in life or death situations. My name is Colonel James Morrison, United States Navy SEALs, retired. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I'm here with my team, Sergeant Martinez, Lieutenant Commander Hayes, Chief Petty Officer Chen, and Master Sergeant Rodriguez. Clara's breath caught. Martinez. The same Martinez from Camp Doyle. We're here today to honor someone who has demonstrated the kind of leadership that doesn't require rank or recognition. Someone who has guided others through darkness without asking for acknowledgement or praise. He turned toward Clara, and every eye in the auditorium followed his gaze. Mrs. Clara Reyes, would you please step forward? The silence was deafening. Clara felt as though the entire world had stopped spinning. She looked at Malik, who was staring at her with wide eyes, then at the 5 men who were waiting with the kind of patience that suggested they had all the time in the world. She didn't move, not because she was afraid, but because she understood that this moment was bigger than her, bigger than any individual recognition. This was about something that had been building for years, something that had started the night she first drove out to Camp Doyle. Colonel Morrison continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the auditorium. 3 years ago, Mrs. Reyes completed one of the most demanding civilian leadership programs in the country. She did it while working full-time, while raising her son alone, while grieving the loss of her husband. She never missed a session. She never asked for special treatment. She never complained. Sergeant Martinez stepped forward, holding a new patch. This one was different, larger with gold threading that caught the auditorium lights. But more than that, Martinez said, his voice rough with emotion. She showed us what real leadership looks like. Not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that lifts others up. Not the kind that takes credit, but the kind that creates space for others to shine. Clara's knees felt weak. She had never told anyone about Camp Doyle. How did they know? How had they found her? The answer came from Colonel Morrison's next words. We've been watching, Mrs. Reyes. We've seen how you've guided your son, how you've built a future for him despite every obstacle. We've seen how you've made yourself small so he could become large. And we're here to tell you that your service, your sacrifice, has not gone unnoticed. Malik was crying now, openly and without shame. He stepped down from the podium, but instead of walking toward his mother, he stood at attention and saluted her. The sight of her son, her brilliant, beautiful boy, saluting her was more than Clara could bear. The tears came freely now, years of suppressed emotion finally finding their release. But she still didn't move from her spot in the aisle. Mrs. Reyes, Colonel Morrison said gently, we're not asking you to come to us. We're coming to you. And they did. All 5 men walked to where Clara stood, forming a semicircle around her. The entire auditorium was on its feet now, not because someone had told them to stand, but because they sensed they were witnessing something sacred. Martinez held out the new patch. Honorary command, he said simply, for the woman who led without a title, who served without recognition, who guided others home. Clara looked at the patch, then at the faces of the 5 men who had served their country with honor. She thought about Hector, about the dreams they had shared. She thought about Malik, about the future she had fought to secure for him. And finally, she spoke. I accept this honor not for myself, but for every parent who has ever been told they don't belong, for every mother who has ever been pushed to the margins, for everyone who has ever been made to feel small. Her voice grew stronger with each word. We belong here. We have always belonged here, and we will never be invisible again." The silence that followed Clara's words was unlike anything the auditorium had ever contained. It wasn't the polite quiet of a captive audience or the expectant hush before applause. It was the profound stillness that comes when truth cuts through pretense so cleanly that no one knows quite how to respond. The ceremony coordinator stood frozen at the podium, her clipboard hanging uselessly at her side. The principal, who had been prepared to deliver his closing remarks about bright futures and endless possibilities, found himself staring at a woman who had just redefined what those words actually meant. Jennifer Morrison, the blonde woman who had orchestrated Clara's musical chairs routine, sat rigid in her front row seat, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the flush of shame creeping up her neck. She had spent years cultivating influence through committee positions and charity galas, but she had never commanded the kind of respect that now surrounded Clara like an invisible force field. Malik walked slowly toward his mother, his graduation cap forgotten on the stage behind him. When he reached her, he didn't embrace her immediately. Instead, he stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder, facing the same direction. Two people who had learned to survive by making themselves small, now taking up exactly the space they deserved. "Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I never knew about the training. I never knew about any of it." Clara reached for his hand, her fingers still trembling from the weight of what had just happened. "There are a lot of things you don't know yet, mijo. But you will, when you're ready." Sergeant Martinez stepped forward, holding a second patch. This one was smaller, simpler, but no less significant. "For the son who inspired the mother," he said, offering it to Malik. "Leadership isn't inherited, son. It's chosen. Every day, in every moment, you choose whether to lift others up or tear them down. Your mother chose to lift you up. Now it's your turn to choose." Malik took the patch with hands that shook slightly. It read simply, "Next Generation." The ceremony resumed, but everything had changed. The principal's closing remarks felt hollow after what they had just witnessed. The traditional pomp and circumstance seemed suddenly inadequate to capture the magnitude of what education actually meant. Not just the accumulation of knowledge, but the transformation of human potential. As the graduates filed across the stage to receive their diplomas, something remarkable happened. One by one, parents began moving from their assigned seats, not to the front rows, but to wherever they felt they belonged. A custodian's wife moved from the back corner to the center aisle. A single father who had been relegated to the overflow section found a seat in the third row. A grandmother who had been told there wasn't room for her folding chair claimed a spot right beside the stage. No one stopped them. No one asked to see their tickets or questioned their right to be there. The arbitrary hierarchy that had governed the morning had simply dissolved. Clara and Malik remained where they were, standing in the aisle like a fixed point around which everything else reorganized itself. The 5 SEALs had melted back into the crowd, their mission complete, but their presence had left something permanent in its wake. When Malik's name was called for his diploma, Clara walked with him to the edge of the stage, not because she needed to be seen, but because she had finally learned the difference between visibility and presence. She had been present for every moment of his journey, but now she was visible too. The photographer who had been so concerned about getting the right families in the professional shots found himself capturing something far more valuable. The moment when a mother and son stood together, unashamed and unafraid, claiming their place in a world that had tried to deny them both. As Malik shook hands with the principal and accepted his diploma, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not the fragile peace of someone who had learned to avoid conflict, but the deep, unshakable peace of someone who had finally stopped running from who she was meant to be. The patch in her jacket pocket felt warm against her chest. Guide. She had spent so many years thinking it meant leading from behind, staying invisible, letting others take credit for her work. But now she understood. A guide doesn't hide in the shadows. A guide shows others the way forward, even when the path is uncertain. Especially when the path is uncertain. As the ceremony concluded and families began to disperse, Clara noticed that several people lingered. Not the committee members or the VIP donors, but the parents who had been pushed to the margins. The families who had been made to feel like outsiders. They gathered around Clara not to congratulate her, but to simply stand in the presence of someone who had refused to be diminished. "We made it," Malik said, echoing the words he had whispered to her earlier. Clara looked around at the faces surrounding them, faces that reflected her own journey from invisibility to presence, and smiled. "No, mijo, we arrived." There was no celebration dinner at an expensive restaurant, no champagne toasts or congratulatory phone calls from relatives who had suddenly remembered they cared. Clara and Malik sat in her 15-year-old Honda Civic in the parking lot of a roadside burger joint, sharing a meal that cost less than most people's coffee orders. Malik's diploma lay carefully placed on the dashboard, catching the late afternoon sun that streamed through the windshield. The honorary command patch sat beside it, two symbols of achievement that represented completely different kinds of victory. "Tell me about Camp Doyle," Malik said, unwrapping his burger with the careful precision he brought to everything important in his life. Clara took a sip of her coffee, black, no sugar, the way she had learned to drink it during those long nights of training, and considered where to begin. "I went there because I was afraid," she said finally. "Afraid that I wasn't strong enough to protect you. Afraid that the world would chew you up and spit you out the way it had done to me. But you were always strong, Mom. You raised me alone. You worked 3 jobs. I was surviving, mijo. There's a difference." Clara's voice was gentle but firm. Survival is about making it through each day. Strength is about making sure the next day is better than the last one. She told him about the night exercises, about learning to navigate in complete darkness using only instinct and training, about the leadership scenarios that forced her to make impossible choices under pressure, about the moment she realized that her greatest weakness wasn't her lack of education or her immigrant background or her widow status. It was her willingness to accept other people's definitions of her worth. Sergeant Martinez used to say that the most dangerous enemy isn't the one you can see coming. It's the one that convinces you to defeat yourself. Clara smiled at the memory. "I had been defeating myself for years, making myself smaller and smaller until I almost disappeared completely. 3 days later, the local newspaper ran a story that changed everything. The headline read, 'The Woman in the Jacket. A Mother's Invisible Service Revealed.' The article, written by a reporter who had been in the audience, captured not just the ceremony, but the larger story of parents who sacrifice in silence, who lead without recognition, who guide their children toward futures they themselves never had the chance to imagine. The story went viral in ways that neither Clara nor Malik could have predicted. Not because it was sensational or dramatic, but because it was true. Comments poured in from around the world, from single mothers working double shifts, from fathers who had been dismissed as not college material, from grandparents raising grandchildren against impossible odds. This is my story too. I've been moved to the back row my whole life. Thank you for showing us that we belong. But the most profound change happened locally. At the next school board meeting, a new policy was quietly introduced. Reserved seating at graduation ceremonies would be eliminated. Parents would sit where they chose. First come, first served, no exceptions. The policy was called the Reyes Resolution, though Clara had never asked for it and wasn't consulted about the name. More importantly, something shifted in the community itself. The invisible hierarchies that had governed social interactions for decades began to crumble. The custodian's wife was invited to join the parent committee. The single father who worked nights was asked to speak at the next graduation. The grandmother who had been told there wasn't room for her folding chair was given a permanent seat on the scholarship committee. Clara returned to her job at the auto shop, but she was different now. She still fixed engines and changed oil, but she also began teaching basic car maintenance to single mothers in the community center every Saturday morning. She called it practical independence, and the waiting list grew longer each week. Malik started college that fall with a full scholarship, but he came home every weekend to help with the Saturday classes. He had inherited his mother's gift for teaching, for making complex things simple, for helping others find their own strength. The 5 SEALs never contacted Clara directly again, but their presence lingered in unexpected ways. A package arrived at her apartment 6 months later with no return address. A framed photo of her and Malik from the graduation ceremony, signed by all 5 men. The inscription read, "Leadership is not about being seen. It's about making sure others can see themselves." On the first anniversary of Malik's graduation, Clara received an invitation to speak at the Camp Doyle graduation ceremony. She stood before a group of civilians who had completed the same program that had transformed her life, and she told them the truth about leadership that no manual could teach. "You didn't come here to become someone else," she said, looking out at faces that reflected her own journey. "You came here to become who you were always meant to be. The world will try to make you smaller, to convince you that you don't belong in the rooms where decisions are made. But you do belong. You have always belonged. And your job isn't to ask permission to take up space. It's to create space for others who are still learning to believe in themselves." The empty chair that had appeared at subsequent school events became a symbol throughout the district. Not a memorial to anyone who had died, but a reminder of all the people who had been made invisible, who had been pushed to the margins, who had been told they didn't belong. Clara never sat in that chair. She didn't need to. She had learned that true leadership isn't about occupying a position of honor. It's about ensuring that honor is accessible to everyone who earns it. As she drove home from the Camp Doyle ceremony, Clara thought about Hector, about the dreams they had shared when they were young and still believed the world was fair. She realized now that the world wasn't fair, and it never would be, but it could be just. And justice wasn't something you waited for. It was something you created, one choice at a time, one moment at a time, one person at a time. Have you ever been moved from your rightful place simply because someone decided you didn't belong there? If you've ever been Clara, if you've ever been pushed to the margins, made to feel invisible, told that you don't deserve a seat at the table, then you know that this story isn't just about one woman's triumph. It's about the quiet revolution that happens when we stop asking permission to exist and start claiming the space we've always deserved. Share this story, not because it's inspiring, but because it's necessary. Because somewhere right now, there's another Clara standing in the back row, wondering if she belongs. And maybe, just maybe, your voice will be the one that tells her, you do. You always have. And you always will.